I'm Teresa Coraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today my topic is When Words Die, Worlds Die. I'm looking at how sticks and stones can break the body, but words attack the mind. This was instigated by a post from the eminent conspiracy researcher Meryl Nass, who began her truth-mongering as looking into anthrax and combating the fear-mongering that was going on with that. She recently posted that she was interested in cross-posting something on words, and that was a topic that I had been interested in putting something together on. So today I'm going to be looking at the book Blessed Unrest by Paul Hawken and quoting Wade Davis, the anthropologist, from that. I'll also be quoting from the FDA in how they have used words to commit atrocities, and from Glenn Greenwald on how atrocities have been used in order to kill words. And then I'll end by going back to Blessed Unrest and looking at the Yamana people and their use of vocabulary and what kind of world that signifies. Let's do this. I'm going to be reading this from a post that I already put together for Substack, hence the glasses. So this will show up on Substack soon after I put it on YouTube, and there it will have both the text and the video, and that's a great place for comments and discussion, much of which has been going on from my last one on Jesus was the OG PSYOPs. Words matter. In one of my early YouTubes, I quote from the Ursula K. Le Guin collection of essays called Words Are My Matter. In my playlist on Ultimate Reality, I talk about whether maybe words are matter and are the only matter. That if we're not separate minds housed in separate bodies, then it's potentially true that all of reality is our shared delusion. And not reality, but the world that we see. And that really the communication between our minds is what is. So I think that that's something that if we're approaching spirituality with the same scientific rigor that we use for other things, that it's a hypothesis that just can't be ruled out by looking at the data. And therefore, we should be considering it as one of potential possibilities. To do otherwise and believe dogmatically in the skin-encapsulated ego is a religion no different than any other. Therefore, words matter. Whatever approximation of truth becomes the operating system of a society is contained in its vocabulary. In all of the world's dominant languages, they are languages of imperialism. They're languages of conquest. They're ones that contain a way of thinking that allows for taking over other people's lands and ruling over those people. Our thoughts are channeled like a train on tracks by the vocabulary and the languages that we're using. And even that is an example of a mechanistic metaphor. And that's the kind that dominates the English language, that there are industrial and techno metaphors that make us think in certain ways of people as more machines than in terms of relationships. We think more in terms of nouns, for instance, than in terms of verbs. In the book Blessed Unrest, Paul Hawken writes a chapter called Indogene that I found fascinating. He says, areas of the world that are the most biologically diverse are also the most diverse in language. Yet the rate of language decline is greater even than that of species loss. Since the conquest, half of the world's languages have disappeared. Of the remaining living languages currently in use, more than 3,000 are dying. Today, there are 362 critically endangered bird and animal species and 438 critically endangered languages with fewer than 50 speakers. At the rate of decline we are now experiencing, half of our living cultural heritage will disappear in a single generation. As cultures disappear at the rate of 30 a year, we find ourselves placing our species' cultural eggs in fewer and fewer baskets. He writes about the strong bias against a polyglot world, and isn't that an excellent word, polyglot? He cites anthropologist Wade Davis, who argues convincingly that a reductionist view of language, one that views it solely in terms of vocabulary and grammar, misses the point. Language is nothing less than the living expression of a culture, part of what he calls an ethnosphere, the sum total of all the thoughts, dreams, ideals, myths, intuitions, and inspirations brought into being by the imagination since the dawn of consciousness. Language also represents breathtakingly intricate beauty, aesthetic and intellectual wealth contained within the invisible folds of sound. Despite language's preciousness, one perishes on average every 2 weeks. What Paul sees in the canon of lingual unity is a view of indigenous cultures that's patronizing, he says, if not simply dismissive. My book, How to Dismantle an Empire, is about creating what could be called polyglot microeconomies. And I think there's a similar bias against that idea, that idea of a future that's small and diverse. Balkanization is a one-word dismissal. It's an argument that ridicules the notion of small-scale sovereignty without the need to engage with the idea. We can't imagine the freedoms that other cultures took for granted to develop their own calendar, festivals, numbering system, rites of passage, style of government, religions, education, sports, morals, clothing, music, art, dance, and money. Another way that words were used to dismiss or demean an argument without the need to actually engage with it was the FDA campaign against ivermectin. And I'm sure that you all saw this ad that had a blue-coated vet with a horse and then a white-coated doctor examining a bespectacled, masked patient who is clearly an intelligent person. And then the slogan was, "You are not a horse, you are not a cow. Seriously, y'all, stop it." Is there anyone at the FDA who you've heard using y'all in their peer-reviewed scientific articles, their prestigious conference addresses, or their well-compensated academic lectures? Why are they adopting this all shucks, down-home country slang now? The language of y'all is set against a photo that clearly shows that these are intelligent, sensible people, and that professionalism is contrasted to backwater hicks out in the boonies with their crazy superstitions. It ridicules users of ivermectin as ignorant hillbillies from Appalachia or Texas or Trump country. And it does this with a patronizing shoulder nudge, like talking to a kid brother who just needs to grow up and stop joshing around. As one of the boys, it laughs at these rubes and invites civilized people to do the same. Never mind those people dying behind the curtain. As I've recommended in previous episodes, Unlimited Hangout has a multi-author essay that is called Mass Formation or Mass Atrocity. It critiques Mattias Desmet's the psychology of totalitarianism. And in particular, they talk about how language is used to normalize violence. They write, "A means of distorting reality so as to maintain a system-justifying worldview is to morally disengage. Moral disengagement is a psychological process by which a specific event, such as mass extermination, can be placed outside the boundaries of one's usual moral frame. A common device for achieving this is sanitizing language. Wrapped in the balm of neutral and forgettable terms, harm is rhetorically cleansed. The reality fails to emotionally register and indifference is invoked. Hence the banality of evil. Just as sexually assaulting victims with medical equipment was described as enhanced interrogation in the War on Terror, so mass killing is disguised using anodyne-sounding medical language for the war on COVID-19. In keeping with the language of atrocity, the psychology of totalitarianism describes the carnage of COVID countermeasures in detached and minimizing terms. For example, Desmet uses the military euphemism collateral damage to refer to people who, quote, fall victim as a result of the measures. The victims include those who died in care homes, those who died because of postponed medical treatments, victims of domestic violence, which increased during lockdown, and most tellingly, people affected by side effects of vaccination. Side effects. Those two soothing words are as close as Desmet comes to considering the hundreds of thousands to millions maimed and killed by the so-called COVID-19 vaccines. I would add that it's an odd phrase from Desmet, people who fall victim, even without the military euphemism of collateral damage. Collateral to what? Who was the target? If someone is a victim, who are they the victim of? Who's the perpetrator? People don't just fall if they're a victim. They're pushed. And a side effect means that there's a main intended effect that was accomplished. What was that with the vaccine? But while these bland words are being used to gloss over atrocities, in another way, atrocities are being used to ban words, maybe particularly ones that are making sense of that last question of who's actually doing this. In an article, Glenn Greenwald explains equating rhetoric with violence to blame one's political opponents for mass murder sprees. He writes, all of this in turn is based on an even more insidious premise that words do not merely express ideas, but are themselves violence. This is the rotted premise, the principal one that is causing more and more people to embrace the virtues of censorship. The idea that having centralized state and corporate authorities ban certain ideas is necessary to keep us safe because those ideas themselves are violent. For people who think this way, there is no difference between expressing an idea and pulling the trigger of a gun because in their worldview, as they themselves say, words are literal violence. Literal violence. The past 3 years has seen the death of words in a way that is unprecedented in my lifetime. The pockets of internet uncensored speech have become both small and fractious. I don't know what that means or where it's leading, and I don't know who is leading and where. But what I want to end with is going back to Blessed Unrest and the Fuegian people, the Yamana, about whom Darwin said, I believe if the world was searched, no lower grade of man could be found. That's the foundation that our Western civilization is based on. And that's where evolution is founded, is the conception of other people as being that lower form of humanity. But a missionary orphan named Thomas Bridges spent 21 years putting 32,000 of their words into a dictionary before he died. Shakespeare used only 20,000 distinct words in his entire collection. The Fuegan language has more verbs than English. These describe subtle nuances of everyday life, from marrying someone selfishly or with impure intent to two people looking at each other, each hoping the other will do something that neither wants to do. The word for depression is the same as a crab molding its shell. The word Yamana itself means the highest form of life, living, being alive. There are now only 2 Yamana speakers, Paul Hawken reports, and they don't talk to each other. I don't think that we have a chance to be fully alive, to become fully ourselves, living in this untethered, scattered world of the internet. I think that there's a way in which one true, deep conversation moves the entire world forward. And some of that certainly happens on the internet, but maybe it also happens in meditation. Maybe there is a way in which our minds can communicate directly without the need for something that can be censored. The lockdowns, I believe, gave us a taste of slowing down, of expanding time, of having leisurely walks and talks. And it wasn't, for some of us, a bad thing. So if that had been intentional, I think as a way of bringing families and neighborhoods and communities together, it could have revived all of those worlds within a world, all of those intimate worlds. I think that words are the lifeblood of relationships. And when they're muffled by masks and socially distanced and fully isolated and psychologically manipulated and turned against each other, those words stop flowing from one heart to another. But the words are only dormant, and the worlds are only dormant for the winter, maybe hiding underground, and that I have no doubt that they'll bloom again in a profusion that will take our breath away. To follow this up, I'm going to suggest we need to agree that looks at the principles of good dialogue, and then a fun one called Jokers to the Left, Clowns to the Right on Matt Taibbi and Russell Brand in an interview from over a year ago that looked at how to make sure you're not being manipulated by journalism. And he, of course, is doing some excellent work these days. Thank you for subscribing, and check out the Substack.